The reason I started this, 26 years ago, I had an appointment with a man up in St. Mary's, Ohio. He had a visual problem. When I arrived at the prescribed time, he was outside, he was saluting his flag, and I waited. It's supposed to be that time, but I waited till he was done. Eventually, he finished what he was doing. He turned around, he saw me, he knew I was going to be there. He came up, and I could tell his eyes were red and he had tears in them. Went inside, we talked for the business I was there for, but he eventually told me, this date happened to be the time I had the 11th hour of the 11th month, 11th day. It was Veterans Day, and it completely went over my mind that morning. But he was out there saluting. He was a lieutenant on Pork Chop Hill in Korea, the Korean War, and it was a terrible battle. I remember seeing the movie in the early 60s, but I didn't know the details. When I went back home, I wanted to look up the details. He had 165 men underneath his command. 25 of them survived. It was a horrible battle, and he was there. And I realized that day that these men, as they age, I wanted to capture their stories before they passed away. And all the stories you're going to hear tonight, I really only have 3 people still alive, and I'll mention those as I come to them. The other ones have passed away, and I'm very pleased that I was able to catch their stories. Today you're going to hear, the book is about people I've met, I actually talked to, but I have other stories, random stories that I'm putting in here that you will see. I want to make one point here. My father, when he was in World War II, he was a bombardier, but during basic training, some of the guys were playing cards, and I thought that was a perfect picture for this book, because what's the story? It kind of gives the impression that they're talking. They're actually playing cards. My dad sent that home to his parents, doodle, on the bottom of a letter, but he did that. It's mainly World War II in the book. There's a couple individual stories of Korea and of Vietnam, because my brother-in-law who passed, he had a heck of a story, and a good friend of mine had a heck of a story that I wanted to recognize that. But in World War II, we needed men fast. They were called citizen soldiers initially because in 1939, we had the 19th size army in the world. Portugal had a larger army than us. We needed men, and we needed them quick. So sometimes they would come, and especially over in Indiana it happened, the young guys would come up and, "Are you over 18? "Yes, sir, I am." Obviously they weren't, but the guy wasn't lying. They were over 18. Had other men join up. I had Ray Deem is a gentleman. He used to live up here in Dayton, but now he lives down by the Ohio River. But he was born in West Virginia. He weighed 1.5 pounds when he was born. His older sister, kept him in a wood-burning stove to keep him warm. Well, he wanted to join when the war started. He went down there, but when he was a kid, he had a condition called hypospadias. I didn't know what it was. I asked him, and he said, basically, I could spray but not stream, So they wouldn't allow him in. So he went to Charleston, West Virginia, and he applied. He said, "I better let you know, I have hypospadias." "Son, we don't care if you can't pee straight, we want you to shoot straight." So they let him come in. Interesting man. Clyde Conley is another fellow from West Virginia, and he told me they only wanted boys from West Virginia or Kentucky to fill this spot. It's called Raiders and Scouts. What they did, numerous, Operation Torch, D-Day, Okinawa, they would go in first. They would hold their breath, they'd go underneath, they'd scout everything out to let the infantry know who were coming behind them. But they only wanted boys from there because we knew how to hold our breath up to 5 minutes underwater. So Gene Tooney happened to be the head of that. He was, if you don't know who that was, he was a heavyweight boxer back then. This is a guy, his youngest one who ever joined. His name is Clyde Conley. Now, Clyde was 12 years old and he joined. Now, he wasn't living with his mother because his stepdad was a mean man and he was not going to live there. So he just sold newspapers and made a little living for himself. So he'd read the papers, obviously, in the morning, and he saw the Pearl Harbor, what happened. He went and joined up. Now, 12 years old, he had to make himself look a little older, so he put a little darkening, like it was his peach fuzz. He was constantly shaving, trying to get it thicker. He made it a little darker, and then when he went in there, he talked real deep to convince them. They needed people, and he joined up. Later in Okinawa, he got injured, and he made a newsreel. He hadn't seen his mother in years, and she got upset. She saw that in the newsreel and said, called the Navy, said, my boy should be in school, not in the Navy. So she raised heck. I met numerous people who were 15 who joined, and I'll tell a few of their stories. But let's talk about a couple people from Centerville, Ohio. Now, this woman is Nadine Nagel. She was born in Kansas, and in Kansas, she got her degree. She was going to be a teacher. She also got married. The war started. Her husband, Dick Cansfield, was a pilot. He was flying, ran out of gas. They crashed in Wales. So the poor lady, what am I going to do? She lost her husband. She's a young woman. So out of love for her country and love for her husband, she became a pilot. 25,000 women tried out to be a WASP pilot, Women Air Service Patrol. She tried and she became one. Very proud of her. And she lived here toward the end of her life here in Centerville, Ohio. I think the next picture shows her. Yes, it does. I was with her. Everyone wanted to meet her. Another woman I met, I don't have a picture of her right now. Her name was Jean Springer. She was a WASP pilot also. Now the women, it was their duty to get the plane to the destination, Florida, to Buffalo, wherever, East Coast, West Coast. But they had to find their own way back to Sweetwater, Texas. Now you couldn't catch a plane then. The trains were completely full. It was very difficult. So she came up with a couple ways. She became friends with the men at the different train depots, and they would loan her a red flag. She'd go out there when a train's coming and do the flag. They would stop. She'd hitch a ride. She got snowed in up in Buffalo, New York, and that's where she told me I learned to drink and to play cards. Here's another woman. She's from Centerville. She's with us. She's 101 right now. She'll be turning 102 this year. Caterina Fortini. She is an Italian woman born in Rome. She lived in Rome. Her father worked for the Palazzi Chicchi, which means White House. Mussolini came into power, and he wanted everyone to sign a form that worked there that they would be a fascist. He says, hell with that. I was born a Republican. I'll die a Republican. And he left. He went to Nice, France, and he got a job over there. He was selling real estate. But after a couple of years, if you had any service at all in another country, you were kicked out. So he had to come back there. Caterina and her parents and her family, Juliana, her sister, they were living on the 7th floor, no electricity. The only light they had was a candle, no water, food once a week, as in bread. Her and her sister Juliana would have to walk 4 miles and 4 miles back, 8 miles to get water for the family, for cooking, bathing, drinking. And they also held Dino Volterra. He was a Jewish man, and his wife. They hid the couple inside their apartment. If they were caught, they were going to be going to the concentration camp and lose their life, just like any Jewish person would. This is in Rome, but the Nazis were there. In fact, her and her sister When they were 16, they got thrown in prison by the SS. And she wasn't there long, but she got thrown in prison. This is her husband. Now you say, wait a minute, he's kind of young. Well, he was, but not when they got married. But I wanted this picture. His name is Richard Hedrick. Now the two met really right toward the end of the war. Richard Hedrick, he had a heck of an interesting life. When he was young, like in this picture here, he was in movies with Shirley Temple. He was in a movie with Bing Crosby. He swam the Long Beach Bay at 2 years old. He was classic violinist. He was evangelist, a big-time evangelist out there, and he was good friends with Orville Wright. Plus, the reason he came into Rome and he met Katerina was Dwight Eisenhower gave him a commendation. He had the highest numbers of flights. He had 96 flights, which is unheard of, and he never lost a man. Richard Hedrick was his name, and they married. How'd this get here? We're familiar with McDigger's Pub. Now, I just heard this in June of this year. It's kind of interesting. There was this man, Robert Bob Warner, from Centerville, Ohio. He was there, it was either the 60s or 70s at McDigger's Pub with his son-in-law, and he was looking across the pub there. Does everyone know where McDigger's is in Centerville? It's kind of in the middle of town, okay. He was down there and he saw this man on the other side of the tavern. He says, I know him. I know that guy. He went up there. He says, I know you. He says, no, you don't. Yes, I do. I know who you are. No, you're mistaken. It's not me, whatever. He says, yes, I was a pilot in World War II. I got shot down. I was a prisoner of war, and you were the guard. You guarded where we were at. He went back to where he was on the other side of the tavern, and a man left. But he was convinced that man was the guard. Very likely, we had a lot of Germans over at 10 Lincoln. Is that right? It's 10 Wilmington. 1 Lincoln, it's a retirement home over in Kettering. There was a lot of Germans that were over there in Dayton. This is a Centerville person also, the woman way back there talking to the Queen. Now, Jimmy Doolittle's up front, but her name is Marion Nelson, and she lived in Centerville, and she was proud of that picture. She allowed me to take a picture of her picture, but the biggest thing she was proud of is her granddaughter was the first female Marine One pilot they ever had, and she flew for George Bush, the second one. This guy's a snooper. The guy on the right, he's a pilot out of West Milton. Now, I didn't know what a snooper was. Is that a detective? Is that someone who looks through the windows? Who knows? But interesting, I thought, when I found out the story, that his name is Gerald Starner, and Gerald would fly a B-24. There would be 2 of them that would take out. And he had this one trip, they were over in the Pacific. This one trip, it would end up taking 17 and a half hours. They'd have to get there. They're always flying at night. They'd get there and get back. He had just a tiny puddle of gas left. So they got to their destination. They had radar at this time, and they were going to it, 2 planes. The first plane went in at 10,000 feet. That drew the searchlights and the anti-aircraft guns to shoot at the top plane, 10,000. He would follow them at 300 feet. You can't miss at that distance. And he would drop 2 500-pound bombs, and he'd be on his way coming back. Now, he got in a little late into the war, but he was dying to go, but that's a good thing because he was not many guys around, but a lot of girls. So he met girls, and this is his wife, May. This is a fella named Steve Thomas. Now, Steve Thomas was in World War I. He was at Parker Co-op when Don Walters, who was a World War II participant, told me he was my teacher, my geometry teacher in Parker Co-op. And they called him Goose Egg. I said, why? He said he'd go down the aisle in the hall, he'd see one of his students, he'd ask him a question, geometry question. If you got it right, 10 points. If you got it wrong, a goose egg. He is recognized over at the Air Force Museum. You can see they have a display with him there, pictures and his story. But they also have a sock. He brought down the ace in World War I for Germany. And you'll see a sock in there with blood on it. When he landed, he had to get a penknife out and take a bullet out of his ankle. But a local guy. Now, going back to the man I saw just a minute ago, Gerald Starner. And Gerald, he was proud he had a 7-foot short snorter. I said, what is that? Well, a 7-foot short snorter. Whenever these guys would go to a different base, there's different denomination. Different countries have different types of money. And so the guys would always collect the money. They'd tape it together like this is taped together. And when they went to a bar, everyone would find out who had the smallest short snorter. With his 7 foot, he never did, but the guy with the shortest snorter had to buy a round. All right, this is Pee Wee Martin, which you might know pretty much of. He was well known around here. He died on 9/11 in 2022, but I first met him in 1968 because I was good friends with his son, David Martin. They were both 101st Airborne, different wars. David was in Vietnam. He was in World War II. He never wanted to go to war. He was against it. 87% of Americans were against World War II. We just came out of World War I. They didn't want to participate, but he started noticing different men. He worked at a tool shop in North Dayton. Different men were going even up to 35 years old and with children, so he joined up. But Pee Wee had an illustrious career. You've seen Band of Brothers, I suspect. He was a band of brother, Company G, and they had to run 3 miles up, 3 miles down Mount Currahee. It means stand alone. And brutal, but they called him Pee Wee, 106 pounds, and he stayed that throughout his life until the end where he actually went down. But he was in the invasion of D-Day. D-Day is on June 6, 1944. He left on June 5th, 1944. Him and his group, they flew over and they were in a parachute behind the lines to protect the guys and knock out the Germans. So if you ever saw the movie Longest Day, there's a scene in there where a guy named Red Buttons, he parachutes, he's imitating that portion, and he lands on a church steeple. His parachute lands on it, and he's caught, and the Germans were shooting at him. I asked Pee Wee, is that Hollywood or is that really true? He says, well, it's not really true because 2 men got caught on that steeple, and they both lived. But he goes into big detail about that whole, it was in St. Mary Glace, it's behind the lines in Normandy. He goes into minute detail of what went on. There was one fella, they had, I think it was a CBS newsman, going in the plane with him, and he was talking to one of the young fellas who was going to jump. Are you nervous? No, not really nervous. How come? He says, well, my parachute here, it's made by ABC Parachute Company. That's not the name of it. But that parachute company, that's the town I came from, the hometown I came from. They make parachutes there. You still not nervous? No. Well, that's surprising. How come? See this pack by, the initials there? That's my mother. So he was not nervous. The other guy here, Dick Cole. He's from Steele High School, a Dayton high school, where Pee Wee is from Kaiser. Now, Pee Wee lived in Bellbrook, Sugar Creek Township, right down the road. Dick Cole eventually moved to Arizona, but he was from Dayton, and he was Doolittle's co-pilot. On the way back, they ran out of gas, I beg your pardon. They had to parachute. He parachuted, and eventually he made it out. If he had parachuted 5 feet one way, it would have been a big drop, and he probably could have died. But he had like 87 missions going to the China-Burma India Trail. We were supplying China with goods. This is a fellow named Phil Holstein. Now his son told me this, Gary Holstein, he's from Miamisburg. He said, Dad, he was a pilot. Now before he was a pilot, he had gotten married a few weeks before he went overseas. But Phil Holstein was over there, and he flew a juggernaut. They would strafe the Germans. This is toward the end when we were, I would say, March of 45. It was toward the end. He was asked by the other guys in the barracks saying, Phil, we're having a dance this Saturday. We need to have some girls. You're the only one who can speak French. See if you can round up some girls to come to the dance. So he could speak French. He goes out there and he finds a couple young ladies. He's talking to them. All of a sudden, some fellow from the other side, Bill Jones, Central High School. Oh, crap. He ran back to the barracks. He wrote his wife of 3 weeks. It's not what you think, honey. But he was strafing the Germans, and a Luftwaffe, a German plane was coming at him. He shot Phil down. He was a prisoner of war. The next night, from being shot down, he was having dinner with that pilot who just shot him down. Now, the guy spoke perfect English. He went to the University of Connecticut, so no doubt he could speak well, and he did. But he was trying to convince him, he was using psychology on Phil here, that it's over for you guys because FDR had died that day. So he's just trying to work a little psychology on him. This is John Wonder. He lived here in Centerville down at Bethany Lutheran. He's a good man. John, every morning at his house, he would play reveille on a speaker. You'd hear it, the neighborhood would hear it every morning. Every evening he would play taps, but you could set your clock to it, him and his wife, Barbara. But he was a B-24 pilot stationed in Italy, and this is where we attacked, they called it the German gas station. It was in Romania, Palasti, Romania. We wanted to take all that gas out, and we did a pretty good job, but we had to fly very, very low to bomb them. And they got a lot of our guys, but on the way back, all these planes came in, and they had all branches and shrubbery and everything underneath the undercarriage of their plane because they were flying so low to avoid all of the anti-aircraft that the Germans had. Now, this guy's the only, I know 2 people that went in this order, first to Purdue and then to MIT. John was one of them, and Neil Armstrong was the other. So a pretty smart guy. Here's another guy local. He ended up working in chemistry at a University of Dayton, but Dolph, he was in a Dutch East Indies. His parents had a plantation. They sent Dolph home to Holland. Now, in Holland, he was going to go to college. He did. His brother, who was a little older, he got caught when the Japanese started taking all the different islands prior to us being involved. But Dolph was escaped 3 times from the Germans. The first time was he wanted to go south. He left Amsterdam, left Holland. He's on a bicycle. First time he jumped in behind a horses pulling hay. The Germans stopped him. They used the pitchforks, couldn't find him. Didn't know he was there, but they didn't get him either. He got his way to Paris, France, and the Vichy government, which were really puppets of the Germans, they threw so many people into jail, Jews, Catholics, gypsies, anybody and everybody in jail. He was in there, and he got to know other prisoners, and there's this one, he learned his language, whatever that language would be. And that man died in prison. The conditions were horrible. They'd sleep on cement, just rags for clothes, very little food. But the man died. During roll call the next morning, when they were doing roll call, he mimicked his language. So he was able to get out. So now him and another fellow, they were working their way. That was the second escape. They were working their way. They wanted to get to Spain, which was a neutral country. So they somehow got a ride on a train, and they're very close to Pau, France, which is on the southern part of France. They wanted to get to Spain. Some SS officers were coming down and coming down the aisle. So they both pried open the sill around the window on the train. They were on outside of the train. That was as it was rumbling, and they were able to hold on like Spider-Man, I guess, and they never saw him. Eventually, they jumped off and walked the 40 miles to Spain, and they went down the Pyrenees Mountains on a trail, but they really stayed off the trail because that would be very dangerous. He made it to Portugal. He got a boat, that's the third way. Made it over to Annapolis, Maryland. He was trained over there in tanks, and he got back in the war for his country. Then he made it here. He met his sweetheart, and they married down to Cincinnati, and they lived over in Bellbrook. Got to put this fella in. He was 13 years old when Pearl Harbor started. He lives in Cincinnati. He's another one that's still alive, but his name is Walter Oka. He's a Japanese American. They're called Nitsis. He had 7 brothers. They all were soldiers, including him, for Americans. But on Pearl Harbor, he would always go down there every Friday morning because the sailors would be out all week. They'd come in on Thursday night. He would skate down there, and he would shine their shoes because all the men were going into Honolulu Friday night and have a good time. So he wanted to look spiffy. And he told me, I asked him, what'd you get? Typically, a nickel every time he did it. He's shaking his finger. Once I got a dime. So it was a good deal. Walter Oka. And like I said, he became a Nitsi. He was an interrogator for us. This is Doc. I don't know his last name. They just call him Doc. He was on the USS Hornet. Now this was the boat that the 16 planes took off Doolittle. Total of 60 men took off that were in the Doolittle raid. Now, many of them got killed there. There's about 4 or 5 who were captured by the Chinese. And if you ever read the book or saw the movie, Ted Lawson wrote it. He was one of the pilots. And it is about the whole ordeal that he had. Now, he had a bombardier on his plane. And that man, when that plane crashed in the China Sea, he was thrown through the plexiglass windshield, and he was hurt pretty bad. He made his home back to Washington State. He survived. He got better. This was in April of 42. Now, in November of 42, he's back in the service. They don't send him back to the Pacific. They send him to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he's flying a B-26 from Fort Wayne to Atlanta. He gets over Frenchtown, Ohio, right next to Versailles, Ohio, and he nosedives, and he gets killed. He nosedives into the ground. And from my understanding, for years, the farmer there, whenever he tilled it up in the spring, he would find a lot of plane parts. But here he made it through the Doolittle Raiders, and he dies on the battlefield of Ohio. If you have ever gone to the Air Force Museum, it's located on Bong Street, B-O-N-G. Now this is Richard Bong. Richard Bong was the ace of aces in the Pacific. Here he is with his plane, and on the fuselage, he writes his girlfriend's name, Margie. And he has a nice painting of her too. He had 42 kills. Like I said, he was the ace of aces. And the one he was fighting with, or battling for the ace of aces, was a guy named Tom McGuire. Now, Richard Bong has, country style looks, and where the other fella, he's got a pencil thin mustache, Hollywood looks, Tom McGuire. But we've all heard that statement, hell hath no fury like a scorned woman. Tom McGuire named his after his girlfriend, Pudgy. You don't do those things. What's interesting here, this past May 2024, In New Guinea, they found his plane in the trees all over in the jungle. They found it, identified it by the plane number, but also there was good old Marge still on the side. Just not that many months ago. Here's a local lady. Her name is Marion Childress. She's from Franklin, Ohio. And Marion knew what she wanted to do in life when she was 8 years old. She wanted to be a missionary. Now, when she was 18 and she graduated, she also now wanted to become a nurse. So she went to Miami Valley Hospital. She became a nurse. She merged both different professions together. She took off from San Francisco. She arrived in the Philippines on December 8th, day after our Pearl Harbor. Because of the international timeline, it was really the same time the Japanese attacked them. So she was a prisoner of war too. She was kept without food, very little food, in the dormitories where the nurses were living out there in the Philippines. This is a gentleman named Major Martin. This is a gentleman named Major Martin. Now, that doesn't make too much sense. They had an operation. After Operation Torch, which is when we invaded Africa, the next obvious one is to go to Sicily. But we didn't want Hitler to know that. Hitler thought we would, and that was a good guess. But what we decided is Major Martin, he had inside his lapel all these important papers. He had papers of a receipt from a restaurant that he took his fiancée to over in England. Also papers of a wedding ring he bought her, different things like that. But also it showed top level, top secret, that we as allies next will be going to Crete and Sardinia. That's the second biggest island off Italy. So his ship blew up outside a small little fishing town in Spain. Now, Spain is neutral, but we knew that little fishing town was partial to Adolf Hitler. So they found Mr. Martin, but it was this Mr. Martin who actually committed suicide by eating rat poison, but he was the same height. They kept in the water, he looked like hell. But they thought this was Major Martin. The word got back to Hitler. He moved 2 divisions out of Sicily because they were preparing for us. One went to Crete, one went to Sardinia. We attacked Sicily, and it was much easier by doing it that way. Now, the title of this, Operation Mincemeat. Now, we had 2 people. We had Harold Gross, who went to Incarnation Church right down the road. He was a part of it. There was 1,000 men a part of it, but I'm bringing him up because he was local. But the man who put it together is the person who wrote this children's movie. Can't see it. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Ian Fleming also did all of the James Bond movies. I found that remarkable. But he was a smart fella for the English, and he came up with this idea, and it worked. When I was 17, I got a job at Gold Circle right over here on 725. Some of you might remember that place. I was just 17. I didn't know 2 nickels from a dime, didn't know how to use a time clock, but this is a manager down there. He was much older than this picture because this is Dwayne Ayers, man I knew very well. He was 42 at the time, if I did my math correctly. Here he's 17 years old. He was on the first wave at Iwo Jima, and it was miserable there. We had so many men killed. They had 156% wounded rate, his division. That means you get wounded once, you go back on the medical ship, you come back out, you get wounded again. Lost so many men there. The only Medal of Honor winner we had from Montgomery County was a man that was on there. Tony Stein is his name. I don't have his picture right now, but Tony Stein went to Kaiser High School, and he worked in a tool shop too. But he was on that first wave, and there was a downed Navy plane. He took off the machine gun from the Navy plane, much more rapid, twice as fast as a regular machine gun. And he was able to go up into Iwo Jima. They had pillboxes everywhere, camouflage that looked like sand. So if you're heading up the beach, you have Japanese fighting from in front of you, shooting at you, beside you, and behind you. It was just a miserable time. But he had his machine gun. He would go into those pillboxes and take care of business. He kept doing that, and it weighed 22 pounds, the machine gun, he called it the Stinger, from the Navy plane, 22 pounds and 11 pounds for the bullets. He would kept running down to the ship to get more ammo. Back and forth he would go. He would throw off his helmet and throw off his boots so he could run faster through that black sand. He would pick up wounded soldiers and take them with him to get repaired. They have, I understand, at the Marines during training, they have a athletic thing where you run that same thing he did, back on Iwo Jima. Not this is Dwayne Ayers. I'm talking about Tony Stein. Russell Cox, he's an Ohio guy. He was the first man to hit Market Garden, which this was in September of '44. Our master plan was after D-Day is to go up there and cut around to the right. The Ruhr Valley is where all their metal was, the Germans' metal, but it kind of flopped big time. But Russell Knotts was the first man to hit the ground. We had the British Airborne parachuting in. We had the 82nd, the 101st, the Polish brigade. This is the most parachutes ever on a mission, and he was number one. He had the radio attached to his leg. The radio hit first, then he hit, and that one radio they had was busted now, thanks to untimely landing from his leg. Russell became extremely wealthy, owned a steel company over in Columbus, and they called him the Man of Steel. He passed away last year. His longevity, he said, was attributed to drinking milk rather than alcohol. You might know of his cousin, some fellow named Don Knotts. This is a great day trip for you. This is a World War I. I'm going to say it real quick. I met this guy in '77. The Loveland Castle, if you've ever heard of that, it's worth the trip down there. This man was in World War I. He died. He was declared dead. 4 days later, he was declared undead. That's how they do it, I guess. His blood was able to save about 60 men. This was during the Spanish flu, and they had a certain type of blood that saved it. He stayed over there. He knew so many languages. He knew 6 languages before he ever went to school. And the first day in school was at Colgate University only because it was the closest to his house in New York. He lived in Oneida, New York, but he self-taught himself, incredibly brilliant. He knew all these languages. But when he got to Colgate, the other kids thought he was stupid because he didn't know Latin. Back then, you had to know, they taught Latin. It was common for any course in high school. So he decided he'll add another language, and that was Latin. He'd go to a local high school, he learned Latin. Now he had 7 languages. He was working under General Pershing. They used him as an interrogator because he could interrogate anybody with his language skills. He gets down there, he has all these kids. This is down toward Loveland. He taught Sunday school every week. He had 1,000 different jobs that he did. I'm exaggerating there. A lot of different jobs. But the boys loved him. They wanted him to build a castle because he had 5 architectural degrees, economics degrees, all taken over there in France. He went to Toulouse University. He had all these degrees. Like I said, he was brilliant. He came here and the boys wanted to help him build a castle. So it was too detailed, but everything was always in denominations of 10. He stressed to be good people. The 10 is always to remind the boys of the 10 commandments to behave. And interesting guy. If you were to go down there, it's well worth the trip. And talk to the men in charge now. They were boys at one time. He put 27 kids through college during the Depression. Interesting man. Eventually, he did die.
He built the castle.
Yeah, he built the castle, yes. And the boys love the castle. It's huge. It's very interesting. A day trip, you'd well like it. A lot more stories than that. This is a picture of Patton on the left, Omar Bradley in the middle, and Bernard Montgomery on the right, beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. Now, so many different stories there in the Battle of the Bulge that I contacted guys like Pee Wee. He told me what in detail, but he remembers exactly what he had for Christmas dinner in '44. It was snow, cordite, and lemon extract. That's the only food they had. The lemon to give it a little flavor. The cordite was covered over all the snow. You had a gentleman named Claire Guy. He went by the name Boots Guy because the last time I saw him, it was in a nursing home, and he told me, I'm still mad at my mother for calling me Claire. I said, Boots, did you have any other nicknames? Yeah, I did. He says at mail call, the mailman, or whatever you would call him, would call out his name. His last name is Guy, G-E-U-Y. Okay, you got mail for Guy. Two guys would butt heads. They'd walk up, they'd butt heads because the other fellow's from Louisiana. He had a Cajun name, G-A-E-Y, pronounced Guy. So the next day, the mailman came with, the next time he came, and he thought he'd give him a phonetic name. So when he came to Boots, he said, got mail for Gooey Guy, and he came and got it. He was an engineer, and he was real proud because Patton made comment of how nice the foxholes were. It was so cold, down to 30 below, it was difficult to dig it. And so he was an engineer. He'd have caps and he'd have dynamite. He told me about 100 different foxholes, and he was just proud that Patton said that. He drove a car for the lieutenant, one of the bigwigs. They were driving in a convoy, and they noticed no one's behind them. So they turn around, they go back, and the guard and the car trying to go through, they were not saying niceties. A lot of unpleasantries is what he was saying. They were yelling at each other in words that can't be repeated, I'm sure. But the guard's word for you to get through, he would say, lost, and the password is echo. So the guard would say lost, and everyone would say no. On and on it went, and they finally had to clear it out. And I had a gentleman, Orville Williams, a local fellow. He was in tears, and that happened numerous times when I talked to people. This would bring up some haunted memories of them, and he just remembers in Battle of the Bulge, his good friend was begging him to kill him, begging Orville to kill him. And I never would not pry, but it's just very sad him thinking that. But continue on. Oh, I got to tell you, they had so many Germans coming through, so we would have to come up with ideas to find out if they really are Americans because they were using American language. So Germans are terrible with R's and W's. So they were supposed to repeat certain things like, rotund Rosie ran rapidly around the rugged rocks. That's easy for me to say, but not hard. It's very hard for a German. Or W's and V's also. William wilted visibly when Vera whipped off her woolies. They just couldn't pull it off. There was a very popular song in '44. Very popular, everyone knew the words, but we'd have the Germans try to sing the song, and they just couldn't do it. It's Mersey Dotes and Dozy Dotes, they would just flub it all completely. They couldn't get that song out, even though all the Americans knew it because it was a big hit. We would intentionally spell on identification papers that they had identification wrong. And the Germans were so precise on their fake identification labels that looked like the American ones, they would spell it exactly where we would be missing a letter or an E and an I would be reversed. Benjamin Franklin actually came up with that years ago. This is Pee Wee again, or James Martin, in the Eagle's Nest. That's where Hitler was in Austria. He and the 101st were the first ones there. And I asked him, did you get anything? Because the victors go the spoils. And he was telling me a lot of different things he had. They had over 10,000 bottles of liquor in there. He said that there was this one guy in the 101st, he took one of the staff cars. And the staff car, a general from behind the lines came up and said, I want that. I'll be back in a half hour. I'm taking that with me. And so General took off to get a driver. And Pee Wee said to the guy who initially took it, said, you didn't put much of a fight up there. How come? He says, they're not going far. He's not going to get far at all. Well, the general came back, it wouldn't start. He took a machine gun and just busted the block. He told me that staff car is in Dayton right now. They cannot sell it because there's no title. So I went down to that little museum next to Chaminade, Packard Museum. I asked them about it. They never heard of it, but it's a story. Now, Boots went down there. I said, what'd you get, Boots? Because he was in the 101st Airborne also. He says, well, my buddy and I, we got a stretcher, just a regular stretcher. We filled it up with pink champagne. That's him. That's Boots right there. This is at an event. That's with Rosie the Riveter. But the girls loved him. When I say the girls, the younger women, they really took a liking to Boots. I'd take him many places. Here's a gentleman from the Dayton area. Bill Cooper's his name. Again, the 101st. I knew that because when I got to his house, he had a T-shirt and a hat on. He wouldn't say much. I was there for business. He wouldn't say much, but when I got ready to leave, he had a commendation on the wall. It said, Boots, Bazooka Cooper. I said, Mr. Cooper, I can't leave until I hear how you got that name. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, and his superiors said, I need you to take that Panzer tank coming down. So he got in a position. He had his bazooka on his shoulder already, but the man with the artillery, there was no shells at all. He didn't have any. So he says, I figured I'm just going to stay there. And Mexican standoff. So that Panzer tank is coming, it stops. This fool's not moving. He must have something planned. So the big Panzer tank starts lurching back and forth, and it took off. And that's how Bill Cooper got the name Bazooka. Pabst Blue Ribbon. During World War II, England, they were being constantly bombed by the Luftwaffe. They took many of their kids and sent them out into Wales. I met a woman from Dayton area, Page Manor, but she was a 7-year-old girl, put on a train. They went out to Wales. They stopped at the different stops just out in the country, and an old couple took them in. She said I was allowed 1 ounce of meat a week. I would lived underneath the table in the alcove. I didn't see my family or my brother who was with me because they didn't want him, and he was 12 years old. So in 5 years before she ever saw. Now, they sent many kids here to America. And this gentleman here, his name is Otto Spaeth. He was commissioned on Armistice Day in the 20s. And now I don't really have a job. He went back to Decatur, Illinois. And from Decatur, his father had a brewery. There's no sugar at all, so he was using sugar maple to use as a sugar supplement for beer, because you have to have sugar for beer. So in Decatur, his brewery was Blue Ribbon. He took the son did, Autospace. He took that and he went around to different breweries, including Pabst. He says, that's how I made my first million. So now Pabst became Pabst Blue Ribbon. They were the #1 beer in World War I. Now, I was going back to Operation Pied Piper. He would take kids. England would send their kids over to America, but they'd have to be the same religion. So there's a Jewish girl that went up on Grand Avenue to a Jewish family. There was 3 kids that went to a house in Springfield, Shakers, movie theaters, took them in. And Otto Spaeth took in Tony Bailey. He's the second one there. This is a guy named Hugh Schaefer. He's out of Wilmington, Ohio. Now, he was on D-Day, and on D-Day, he was behind the lines. He got lost from the rest of his troops. He was in a French person's barn. He allowed him to stay there. Eventually, some more Americans came, and he was able to hook up with them and continue. But the farmer was so appreciative of the Americans, he gave him a handmade little violin. And you could see it, he had it under his globe there. But another thing that happened, the Americans, later on, we were going through Germany, and we had a little trusty book that explained German, transferred German to English. So we were in this German town, only German residents were there, typically older, and he got the book out, and he wanted to say, come out, we won't shoot. So in the best German he could do, he read it, Rauskommen, wir nicht schiebeln. They all came out. They were all laughing. Rather than come out, we won't shoot. Come out, we won't I didn't say it. You get it. This is the Don Gentili. He was the ace in Europe. He had 28 kills. This is Dwight Eisenhower putting the pins on him. They called him the one-man Air Force and Captain Courageous. Shelby King. He made it up from the eastern Kentucky. Shelby never made it really into the war. They said he handled the psychos, post-traumatic stress disorder. They call them the psychos. He was good friends with this guy named Ray Anthony. And Ray Anthony, he had a nighttime job. He was in Glenn Miller's band. He played the trumpet. In daytime, he worked on the submarines over in Hawaii. So he said, when this war is over, I'm going to start my own band. So Ray Anthony did. I looked it up. He had 2 big hits. The A side on the one hit was Bunny Hop. The B side was a song that every one of you know the words to. Your grandkids know the words to. That person peeking through the door, everyone knows the words to. Hokey Pokey was this hit. Young's Dairy. Now, what does this have to do? Right field, they needed help. And they called up Powell Crosley from the Crosley brothers. He was an inventor, a real big-time guy, very wealthy. He owned the Cincinnati Reds, Crosley Fields you heard of. They called him up. They had a secret meeting over at Young's, not the one you know today with the big cow there. They had a secret meeting. They wanted him to come up with a proximity fuse. So the bomb would drop on above Hiroshima versus hitting the ground. And he did. So he helped out there. Now this next picture, I'm really going way back. This is a picture of a woman in her prom a few years ago. Beautiful woman. I believe she's having a birthday this week. I won't say the age, dear. Let's go to the next one. Richard Yount, he was Eisenhower's go-to guy with anything electronics, and there are tons of stories in there. He joined in 1941. He knew the war was coming, so he joined up in Dayton. He was from Bradford, Ohio, and this is his wife. She was at the hospital where Patton was taken, Heidelberg Hospital, where George Patton was taken. This is the one I told you, Tony Stein, the gold medal winner. Johnny McLeod, he was from by Smithville, where the big water tower is, if you know where that is. He was the first man who was on D-Day on Omaha Beach. He was a Higgins boat. He was the first man off, and he made it also to the hedgerows, and he's very descriptive. He was in there. It's very difficult to get through the hedgerows. We had to take it out, and his best buddy got shot right in the eyes by a German in a 15-foot high hedgerow. We, as Americans, a regular GI figured out the best way to take him out. He was a mechanic in New Jersey. We had I-beams. There was 8 different ways the Germans were preventing our Higgins boats to attack on D-Day, and one of them was I-beams. Big, fat, ugly I-beams to prevent ships coming in. But they took them off, they strapped them to a tank, and they used it like a rhinoceros. Marion Adams, quick story here, he was all over the place. He was at Gold Sword, Juneau, Omaha, and Utah Beach during D-Day. He was Okinawa, he was at Operation Dragoon in southern France. But in April of '44, before D-Day, they were doing a dry run, and they were doing over called Slapton Sands, which was in England, but it mimicked what Normandy would be like. So they're just working the kinks out. They came up on Slapton Sands. But when he was watching a 60 Minutes in 1984, a show came on, and he says, on 60 Minutes, that's the way I remember it. They always said like 15 men got killed. But no, the Germans had Schnickel boats, I think is what they're called, E-boats. They worked their way into this dry run. They hit a LST boat. Landing ship tank is what LST stands for. The men called it large, slow target. But they hit that, and many of the men jumped in, 746, 4 times the amount that died on Utah. But the men jumped in, they had their life preservers on, upside down, and they flipped over like that, and they drowned. Horrible. And they kept it quiet for 40 years till the anniversary of that. Frank Anello, he was back again to Kaiser High School. He was on the USS Bunker Hill off of Okinawa, and 13 times kamikazes tried to attack him. 13 times they were dismissed. The 14th time, 2 got through. Now, 1 hit the deck. We had 47 planes ready to take off, and it hit the deck, and it, like a pinball, it started knocking these other planes. It was a towering inferno on that plane. And the other plane dropped it. It went 3 decks. The 500-pound bomb went through 3 decks. So all men on deck, all men to the deck, they had to put the fire out. It took hours to put it out. Afterwards, Frank went down to his cabin. He brought back his torch kit. He went down. He went to the 2nd floor, and all the men there, unfortunately, were like packed like cordwood. They had asphyxiated. All the fumes went through it. He went down again. The pilot's ready to go, but they had drowned. And when the war was over, he lived on a little farm somewhere between Centerville and Springboro. And he went back to work at Delco, and he never talked about it. A nephew found some stuff in the garage. He had 5 medals. He had a letter from Truman and also a letter from the captain about the good works he did. All right, Miamisburg. The man on your left is Lawrence Kaufman. The man on the right is son, Draper Kaufman. Now, Lawrence was an admiral in the Pacific Theater, and Draper was underwater, head of all the underwater demolition that we did throughout there. So, local guys. Now there's Lawrence again with this pilot here. But that pilot, he was flying, and he got shot down close to an island called Chichijima, which is part of the Iwo Jima chain. And that's where they had the satellite or the antenna to contact Tokyo, the only antenna they had. But they had no food, so they would love to shoot down American pilots, and they were cannibals. And so they shot this guy down. They crashed into the water. The other 2 fellows in his plane got killed. He luckily was able to have a little rubber raft, and I don't know if it was the next day or the day after, a submarine popped up, and they saved him. And this is a picture with him with Lawrence Kaufman. But that's President George Bush on the right. George Berghoff, he was country strong. He wanted to be 101st Airborne. He came. His first mission was Market Garden. He got shot down in his plane. It was the ruptured duck is what it was called. And he was a prisoner of war. Well, one of the guys in the POW camp there, he made a trade with the German guard. The American got some Pall Mall cigarettes, a carton of it, from the Red Cross. And the German loved American cigarettes. They're so much better than their cigarettes. So they traded him his Long Johns for the cigarettes. So later on in May 45, the Russians are coming from the east, Americans are coming from the west. They took all the prisoners, they're walking, but they took his Long Johns and made a flag to show to the pilots going overhead.